Boom, and just like that, it is week 11 of the fantasy season, so you know exactly what we're going to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, go over every single wide receiver, and talk about who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in week 11 of the fantasy season. All right, very quickly here, we have two teams on bye week here in week 11, the Indianapolis Colts, so no Pittman, Downs, or Pierce, as well as the New Orleans Saints, so no Chris Olave and whoever else is left on that roster. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick it off with Thursday Night Football. We have the Jets traveling to face the Patriots, and don't know what form of Jets football we're going to get here in week 11, but in week 10, they threw for a whopping total of 54 passing yards with Justin Fields at the quarterback position. Aaron Glenn, head coach of the Jets, has been non-committal in terms of if it's going to be Tyrod Taylor or Justin Fields at quarterback here on a short week on the road. Either way, can't feel great about this passing attack for the Jets, and the only wide receiver I can even consider on this team is going to be Garrett Wilson, who was on the field for 39% of snaps in Week 10 before re-aggravating that knee injury that kept him out the previous two games. So if Garrett Wilson is good to go, which it doesn't really look like he's trending in that direction, once again on a short week, but if he is good to go, he's always a low-end start. Yeah, he'll probably face Christian Gonzalez for majority of this game, which is not good because, well, Christian Gonzalez is a great cornerback, but also there's nobody else for the Patriots to really cover here. Now, the Patriots 19th overall against wide receivers, much tougher against the run than the wide receiver position, but you still got to feel pretty good here in comparison to the fact that it is not as tough a matchup as, per se, the running back position when facing the Patriots. But I guess in the same breath, you can't really feel that great because it's the Jets offense. So I don't really think Garrett Wilson is going to be able to play. We've probably spent too much time on this topic, but if he is out there and available, he's the only Jets wide receiver you can even consider in week 11. Then we move to the Patriots side of things. Okay, this is a decent matchup. The Jets slowly kind of going back and forth, but they are right now 10th overall against opposing wide receivers. Even with the loss of Sauce Gardner at the cornerback position, this is still a pretty stiff unit against opposing wide receivers. And they just allowed Jerry Jeudy to have his best fantasy day of the season, scoring a touchdown and 78 receiving yards off of 6 receptions, which was kind of surprising to see. So I still think with the Patriots being one of the pass heaviest teams in the NFL, this is a good spot for Stephon Diggs, who's had 10 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games, so he remains a low-end start. But it is worth noting he's had 3 touchdowns in 3 straight games, 15.6 fantasy points this past week, his third best mark on the season. He's a solid low-end start. I don't really know how much the Patriots are going to need to throw the football in this matchup. This could turn into a big Travion Henderson, hopefully not Ramondre Stevenson, but a game where the running backs are used quite a bit, right? Nonetheless, there's still a lot of other names here that have had production on the season. We just saw rookie Kyle Williams have a good game, but he only had 1 catch. It was a 72-yard touchdown, only 2 targets, so I'm not trusting him. Demario Douglas came back to earth this past week with 5.4 fantasy points. Mr. No Shoes himself, Mac Hollins, reemerged with 16.6 fantasy points, 10 targets, 6 grabs, 106 receiving yards, but the previous week, 2.9 fantasy points for Mac Hollins. Then Kayshon Boutte missed this past week after having a stretch of 4 touchdowns, 13.5 or more fantasy points in the previous 3 games. So any of these guys can go off. Like I mentioned, the Patriots are one of the pass heaviest teams in the NFL. Drake May looks fantastic, playing at an MVP caliber rate, but it is really difficult to trust any of these other Patriots wide receivers. So unfortunately, unless you're desperate, I'm going to leave all these guys as sits as we approach week 11. I'm headed straight to Underdog to take Stephon Diggs to score a receiving touchdown here in week 11 of the season. Like I said, he has scored a touchdown in 3 straight games. He's now facing the Jets at home on a short week and one of the pass heaviest teams in the NFL with no Sauce Gardner at the cornerback position. So I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Stephon Diggs to score a touchdown here in week 11. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. We're getting a free NFL pick'em to use towards Week 11 NFL action. Take that free pick'em, take Diggs to score a touchdown, and both of those lines hit. You're going to automatically double your cash entry, and Underdog is going to give you $50 in bonus cash once you play through $5 on Underdog when you sign up using that promo code down below, THECATCH. All right, early Sunday morning, we are going to get an overseas game between the Washington Commanders and the Miami Dolphins. Let's start with the Commanders side of things. Deebo Samuel found the end zone in Week 10 against the Lions. 5 targets, 4 grabs, 29 receiving yards, and 12.9 fantasy points. He's just a risky flex for now with Marcus Mariota, quarterback, who was serviceable this past week. No turnovers for Mariota, threw for over 200 passing yards, and 2 passing touchdowns. So there's still some hope here for the Commanders wide receivers, but bear in mind the Dolphins have given up the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the season, and through 10 games on the year, they're only averaging about 100 receiving yards allowed per game amongst all wide receivers they face. So not a great matchup here on the road, or I guess on the road for both teams here, but still ultimately Deebo just a risky flex because the state of the Commanders offense and defense right now is very much so up in the air. And speaking of such, don't even know if Terry McLaurin is going to be good to go this week or not. And actually, I am reading a report that just came out in the last 40 minutes. He will not be playing in Week 11, so he is a sit, still dealing with that quad issue. And then the Commanders have a bye week in Week 12. Wasn't expecting him to play anyways, but we still put him on the screen just in case. But he will obviously be a sit for you guys, and the future is looking pretty bleak for the rest of the season for Terry McLaurin. Will that open up something for Jalen Lane or Chris Moore or another wide receiver on this roster like Robbie Chosen Anderson? What is Robbie Chosen? That's his name now. I'm sorry. No disrespect there. I actually thought that your last name was still Anderson. Robbie Chosen is on this team. Treylon Burks is on this team now. He was actually the most productive wide receiver next to Deebo this past week, believe it or not. He had 8.8 fantasy points, but just 3 targets. So I'm staying away from all the Commanders wide receivers except for Deebo as a risky flex here in this Week 11 matchup. Let's move along. Jalen Waddle remains a start on a week-in, week-out basis, and I would basically consider him an absolute must-start. This Commanders defense is just slowly unraveling. They have now given up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the season. They just got absolutely lit up all across the board by all the Lions offensive starters. They are tied for the 2nd most receiving touchdowns allowed on the season, and over the past 4 weeks they have been one of the very worst overall defenses against opposing quarterbacks and wide receivers. So this is a great spot for Jalen Waddle, who has had 14.2 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games and 2 touchdowns in the last 3 games, and is the only receiving option on this team outside of Devon Achane and a little bit of Malik Washington, who's had some fantasy relevance over the past 3 weeks with 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games, but has only hit double digits in one of those games. So gets some volume, but not a lot, but volume in the red zone. He's facing the Commanders. We've already touched on how bad this defense is. He's a risky flex, but I don't know if his ceiling is necessarily going to be crazy high, and he's the only other wide receiver in this matchup that we can even consider as we move into the weekend. All right, moving into Sunday's early window, we will have the Packers traveling to face the Giants. And as a reminder, I do have to record these videos before Monday Night Football from the previous week has been played. So if there's any injuries to any Packers wide receivers, which would not surprise me, there'll be a pinned comment down below. But I think for the most part, we're just going to have Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson as potential risky flexes. Bear in mind, this is a good matchup this week against the Giants, a bottom 10 unit against opposing wide receivers. So as long as we move into week 11 with Doubs and Watson healthy, they are going to be potential flex options. Looks as if Matthew Golden may have a shot to play in week 10. By the time this video comes out, you guys will know if he played or not. But for now, he is still the player kind of at the bottom bottom of the totem pole here when it comes to the Packers wide receivers. So I like Dobbs more than Watson, but Watson is worth a flyer once again, as long as these guys are healthy moving into week 11. Then we look over to the Giants side of things. Not the greatest, not the worst matchup against the Packers. Defense here in week 11 could be much worse. When we look at overall rankings, they're 16th overall against wide receivers in terms of fantasy points allowed. So we look at Rondell Robinson, 12.2 or more fantasy points in 4 out of the last 5 games. Darius Slayton, double digits in his last 2 games, 11.2 or more, but Darius Slayton now dealing with a hamstring issue. Looks like he's got a good shot to play in week 11, but we'll find out as the week progresses. And then the elephant in the room, Jackson Dart in concussion protocol. And he could very well be kept out of this game because this is not his first concussion on the season. That's going to leave dangerous or Jameis Winston at quarterback. I don't know if this is going to be good or bad for the Giants wide receivers. I don't know. I mean, who knows, really? I mean, I guess if it's Jameis, there's more potential upside. If it's Russ, there's not as much upside. But bear in mind, Rondell Robinson's best game on the season did come with Russell Wilson at quarterback in week 2, albeit they were playing the Cowboys defense, who has allowed the second most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season so far. So Robinson, low and start. Slayton, flexible. We'll see how things shake out with some switch up in terms of the Giants quarterback position, and now a switch up at the head coach position as well, with Brian DeBall being fired. But ultimately, not a lot of players we can trust across the board in this week 11 matchup. Moving along, we have the Texans traveling to face the Titans in a divisional matchup. Let's start with Nico Collins, who I encourage you guys to keep in your starting lineups this past week against the Jaguars. 15 targets, 7 catches, 136 receiving yards, 22.6 fantasy points, and you got to like him again here in week 11, as the Titans are a bottom 10 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. And really, regardless of if it is CJ Stroud or Davis Mills at the quarterback position, I think Nico Collins will just remain a start overall. It's a great matchup for him. And maybe it's better if it's Davis Mills at the quarterback position, but only time can tell. In terms of the other wide receivers here, I mean, same logic we applied last week. They're just all sits for me. This volume in terms of this passing game is essentially impossible to figure out, and there's just nobody here you can really trust. I mean, the true primary number 2 pass catcher on this team is Dalton Schultz at the tight end position, but we did get a solid game out of Jaden Higgins this past week. 15.2 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 grabs, 42 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He was good in week 8. He had 1.4 fantasy points in week 9, so very difficult to trust, but I guess worth looking at. But at times, Hutchinson and Noel in the past couple of weeks have had some productive games as well. So I don't want really anything to do with any of these wide receivers for the Texans if they are not named Nico Collins. Then we look to the Titans side of things here. Tough matchup this week against the Texans, a top 5 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. They've only allowed 5 receiving touchdowns on the season so far, which, if I'm not mistaken, looking at things here, tied for 3rd best in the league. Either way, it's still going to be a very good mark. So, I mean, Chimere DK was doing some things when we last saw this team in action before their week 10 bye week, but week 9, pretty disappointing against the Chargers. Week 7 and 8 did enough to be fantasy relevant, but doesn't have a massive amount of upside with Cam Ward at the quarterback position. Alec Manor also doing some things, and then Calvin Ridley, I don't even know if he's alive anymore, but he's on this team technically. Listen, I don't like this matchup for the Titans offense as a whole. This Texans defense is for real. They're going to come to play. I just don't feel good about any of these guys overall. Chimere DK would be the most startable, I guess. But yeah, it's a tough matchup across the board. I don't think even coming out of the bye week with extra rest, time to prepare, all that stuff, that the Titans are going to be able to do a whole lot. And then they get Seattle next week, so not looking very great overall the next 2 weeks for the Titans offense. And we'll just leave it at that. Everybody in this matchup is a sit other than Nico Collins. All right, next up, we got another divisional matchup. That's going to be the Panthers traveling to face the Falcons. Let's start With the Panthers side of things, tough matchup this week for T-Mac, getting a Falcons defense that's allowed the 8th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And quite frankly, while T-Mac is the undisputed #1 receiving option on his team, the upside just isn't there. He's a low-end start on a week-to-week basis. Hopefully you don't have to do anything more than flex him. And you really just got to leave it at that. I mean, 11 fantasy points this past week, 8 targets, 5 grabs, 60 receiving yards, and that's it. And I mean, we've had 1 or 2 nice games, maybe 2 or 3. He's got 3 games with 16 or more fantasy points. Every other game, 13.3 or less. I mean, this passing attack is just not good. Bryce Young has not thrown for more than 200 passing yards except for 1 game this year. And in the last 2 games, he's had 124 or less passing yards. In his last 3 games, he had 138 or less passing yards and 1 passing touchdown, as well as 2 fumbles and 2 interceptions. So just not a lot here when it comes to this Panthers passing attack. They are living on the hopes and dreams of Rico Dowdle and their defense playing okay. So when it comes to T-Mac, low-end start, we don't need to break down the rest of the Panthers wide receivers. They are not relevant from a fantasy perspective. Drake London had a huge week 9 with 38.8 fantasy points. He followed that up with a very solid 24.4 fantasy points this past week. 8 targets, 6 grabs, 104 receiving yards, and a tutty. So, gotta like him this week, but it's worth noting this Panthers defense is pretty dang good against wide receivers, giving up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. J.C. Horn, a good #1 corner. But it's Drake London. You got to keep rolling with them each and every week. The upside is way too high. We look since week 4. He missed week 8. He had 8.2 fantasy points in week 7. Every other game, 24 or more fantasy points. 2 games over 30 fantasy points in that stretch. And in that same stretch, he has had 6 receiving touchdowns. So keep rolling with them. He is as good of a start as you're going to get. Darnell Mooney, just a sit. We haven't even considered him. Have we considered him anything other than a sit or risky flex this season? But you can't trust him. I mean, he had 8 targets this past week, 1 catch. He's just not going to get it done. Not a player that even really needs to be rostered at this point in the season, in my opinion. Moving along, we got the Bears traveling to face the Vikings. Got some good divisional matchups going on this week. Let's start with the Bears side of things. Okay. Rome Odunze showed back up, came to life this past week, 20.6 fantasy points, 10 targets, 6 grabs, 86 receiving yards, and a touchdown after having a whopping 0 fantasy points in week 9. So that was certainly nice to see. But it's a tough matchup. The Vikings giving up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So I like Rome Odunze. I really encourage you guys to not lose your faith in Rome Odunze, but we still look since week 6, coming out of the bye week in week 5 for the Bears. These are his fantasy stat lines: 5.2, 5.1, 18.4, 0, and 20.6. So there still has been a lot of inconsistency here. He is still the Bears wide receiver that I want to start on a weekly basis, but there's definitely inconsistency across the board when it comes to this Bears offense. So Rome Odunze, low-end start. Leave him at that. Luther Burden, going to be a sit for me. I know he had that big catch this past week. Olamide Zacchaeus came back to earth. Thought he could maybe be a sneaky option for those of you who were desperate. He had 1.5 fantasy points this past week, so it was not there. And then we have DJ Moore, who put up 0 fantasy points this past week and was dealing with a shoulder injury, may not play in week 11. So I have gotten a lot of questions about DJ Moore. I would probably hold on to him. I mean, he still was getting involvement in the previous 2 weeks, although against weaker secondaries, but yeah, I don't think we can start DJ Moore, but I don't know that he's going to be like exiled out of this offense just because he's dealing with this shoulder issue. So I know it was frustrating this past week. It was a good matchup against the Giants, but for now, let's just leave him on the bench and kind of see how the shoulder issue plays out. So it's just Rome Odunze, nobody else there in terms of the Bears wide receivers. Then we move to the Vikings. He's still got to roll with Justin Jefferson. I know, 7.7 fantasy points, but to put things into perspective, this was his first single-digit fantasy point performance of the entire season, and the Bears giving up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the season, as well as being tied for the 2nd most receiving touchdowns allowed to wide receivers on the season. So, good spot for JJ. Keep rolling with them. It'll get better, because it's Justin Jefferson, okay? Then we look at the other names here. Jordan Addison, 11 targets this past week, 3 catches, and then, circling back, JJ had 12 targets, but just 4 catches, and then Jalen Naylor had 6 catches, 5 receptions, 124 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So I've kind of moved Jordan Addison back to the risky flex area, a player that I was really comfortable with for a bit. But with J.J. McCarthy back as the starting quarterback, he's at 8.4 or less fantasy points. He was really thriving with Carson Wentz at quarterback, not so much with McCarthy. And then we have seen Jalen Naylor have 4 or more targets in the last 2 games with McCarthy at quarterback as well. So I don't want to chase last week's points. If it was any other matchup, for the most part, maybe outside of a couple of teams like the Cowboys or Commanders or Steelers, I would be staying away from Jalen Naylor, but I think he's in the risky flex category. We talked about him in the waiver video, mostly due to matchup and because J.J. McCarthy does tend to target him. In terms of Jordan Addison, just got to be a risky flex and got to leave it at that due to the passing volume here being a little bit lower when it comes to Addison over the past 2 weeks. So hopefully he can get back into the swing of things with McCarthy at quarterback. Naylor, definitely risky, but could be a flex option. And JJ, it'll be fine. You got to start him here in week 11. And next up, we have the Chargers traveling to face the Jaguars. Let's start with Ladd McConkey and the Chargers. You got to keep Ladd in the start category going up against a Jaguars team that is bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. They've given up 11 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers on the season, so it's a good spot for Ladd McConkey, who is the most fantasy relevant Chargers wide receiver. It was a tough month of September for Ladd McConkey owners, but for the most part, over the past few weeks, it has gotten much better. 20.7 fantasy points in week 10, 6 targets, 4 grabs, 107 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So since week 5 of the season, 14.9 or more fantasy points in every game except for week 9 against Tennessee. So good spot for Ladd. Let's keep rolling with them. What do we do with the other 2 names at wide receiver here? Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston. Keenan Allen has really started to kind of slowly get phased out. I know he had the big week in week 7 against the Colts, but he has drawn just 5 targets in 3 straight games. And then Quentin Johnston, on the other hand, has had 6 or more targets in 3 of the last 4 games, but has also been wildly inconsistent, and that's basically what we're dealing with when it comes to the Chargers wide receivers. Now, the one thing I think that is worth noting here is Oronde Gadsden at the tight end position did deal with what is now known to be a quad issue, although initially believed to be a knee issue during that game in this past week against Pittsburgh. He's considered day-to-day, and he has really started to take away some of those targets from Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston. If he misses week 11, then this could be a better week for Keenan Allen and or Quentin Johnston. Now, they both have had some good performances over the past couple of weeks, like we touched on, but there's still been inconsistency. So we'll kind of see how this shakes out, but until further notice, can only consider Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnston risky flexes, but I would feel better about them if Gadsden is to miss week 11. We'll find out. All right, now we move to the Jaguars. I don't know what to do with this wide receiver room. I mean, this is a tough matchup. This Chargers defense has been no joke against opposing wide receivers. Only 5 receiving touchdowns allowed on the season, and they've given up ultimately the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So ultimately, we got Brian Thomas still dealing with that ankle issue. Travis Hunter still hanging out on IR. Jacoby Myers just recently acquired from the Raiders. Then my guy Parker Washington hanging around as well. And Dewami Brown, just 1 target this past week, so not really involved. Listen, if Brian Thomas plays, he's back in the risky flex category. That's going to leave Jacoby Myers as a risky flex and Parker Washington as a risky flex as well. I do think that Parker Washington has proven to have the safest floor in terms of a Jaguars wide receiver with 10 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games. Although, like on the waiver video, some of you guys have been bringing this up, like he's getting some, value out of his overall volume in terms of the kick return game and all of that. And for some leagues that matters, for some leagues it doesn't matter. But ultimately, I still think when we look at it here, he's had 7 or more targets in 3 straight games. So he is still getting the attention in the receiving game where like Jacoby Myers, 3 targets this past week. Brian Thomas's last game, just 5 targets. So he is getting involvement at the end of the day. Kind of the opposite thing to deal with here. When it comes to the Jaguars wide receiver room, is Brenton Strange at the tight end position potentially returning this week, designated to return from IR, is technically potentially going to play this week, although he could take another week to rest. If he comes in, he does draw some potential targets at the tight end position, 4 more targets in his first 4 starts on the season and 7 targets in 2 of those games. So he could be a factor that could hurt the rest of these guys. Long story short, it's not a great situation when it comes to the Jaguars wide receivers. The passing game isn't exactly lethal for the Jaguars offense in general. So tough matchup. These guys are just risky flexes. My favorite would be Parker Washington this week, but still, I don't really feel like there's a tremendous amount of upside with any Jaguars wide receiver here in week 11. Except we have the Buccaneers traveling to face the Bills in one of the better matchups here in week 11. Let's start with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver room. Emeka Egbuka, a very solid performance in week 10 to say the least, 23.5 fantasy points, 13 targets, 6 grabs, 115 receiving yards, and a touchdown. This was really nice coming out of the bye week, having 3 straight games for Egbuka where he had 9.8 or less fantasy points and going up against a pretty good Patriots defense in terms of their secondary and Christian Gonzalez being the number 1 cornerback there, right? So could have been a tough matchup, but ultimately the overall passing volume here for the Bucs offense overcame in terms of Emeka Egbuka's stat line, and he also scored very early in that game. So he's as solid as they come. The Bills have been good against opposing wide receivers so far in the season, but they've fallen back slightly, now ranking 13th overall against the position. But truthfully, if you own Emeka Egbuka, you are starting him really regardless of what happened the previous week or what the matchup is. He's as solid as they're going to come here in week 11. Then we look, the next most productive wide receiver would be Tez Johnson, 5 targets, 4 grabs, 42 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns in week 10, 20.2 fantasy points. So this is going to be another competitive matchup, another week where the Bucs are throwing the football a lot. This is a good spot. Tez Johnson, as solid of a flex as you're going to get, and very close to, like, I don't know. I don't want to call him a low-end start. I don't want to call him just a for-sure start. But he's very close to one of those 2 categories with 11.5 or more fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 games and 4 touchdowns scored in the last 4 weeks as well. But the Bills are much softer against the run, so I do think we'll see a good bit of Rachaad White in this matchup. But the passing volume, like I've said, is going to be there too. So Tez Johnson, very, very solid flex, very close to being considered more than a flex here in week 11. But once again, like, you got him off the waivers. He's probably not going to even be a wide receiver 1 or 2 in your lineup. So as good of a flex as you're going to find here in week 11. Don't know if Chris Godwin's going to play this week or not. As a matter of fact, latest reporting is now indicating that he's not going to play. So he will be a set. Cameron Johnson, Sterling Shepard, anybody else left over here, not enough production to be fantasy relevant. So it's Egbuka and Tez Johnson for the win here in week 11 for the Bucs. Then we look to the Bills. Like it is every week, it's Khalil Shakir as a low-end start. 12.8 fantasy points this past week, 9 targets, 7 grabs, 58 receiving yards, and that is it. That's what he does every week, right? 11 fantasy points or more in 3 straight games, 11 or more fantasy points in every game on the season except for 2, but he's only had 17 or more fantasy points in 2 games. The floor, very safe. This Bucks defense certainly isn't anything to sneeze at, but they're also not great, and the Patriots kind of had their way with them this past week, and the Bucks have fallen to a bottom 12 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So I like Shakir this week, especially with the Dalton Kincaid injury. We could see some more potential volume go his way. Josh Palmer, nothing to talk about here. Keon Coleman did score a touchdown this past week, but we look at it on the season. In games where Keon Coleman has not scored a touchdown, he has had 7.5 or less fantasy points. In games where he scored a touchdown, he's had 10 or more fantasy points, but he's only done so in 3 games. So not going to consider Keon Coleman, way too risky. It's Shakir for the Bills, and that is it here in Week 11. Final game of the early window is going to be the Bengals coming out of their bye week, traveling to face the Steelers, coming off of a Sunday Night Football loss to the Chargers. Let's start with the Bengals. This is a great spot as the Steelers have now fallen to the team allowing the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the season. This will probably change after Week 11, where the Cowboys will find a way to give up a ton of fantasy points to the Raiders, but we'll talk about that later. Ultimately, on the season so far, the Steelers have given up the second most receiving touchdowns of any team, only to the Commanders, and they have only given up 8 receiving touchdowns, which isn't great, but is certainly not bad compared to other teams in the bottom 10. So the opportunity is here for 2 of the very best wide receivers in the league, Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, to have monster days coming out of their bye week. Plenty of time to prepare with Joe Flacco at quarterback. The last time we saw them in action, Chase had 17.1 fantasy points. Higgins had 33.1. Higgins has been quietly very, very, very good with Joe Flacco at quarterback. I don't want to say quietly, but I feel like everybody just talks about Jamar Chase, and really Higgins has just been like the one he gets forgotten about on the field and is like consistently scoring touchdowns. But since week 6 of the season, when Flacco took over a quarterback, we're looking at double-digit scoring for Higgins and Chase in every game. And in that stretch, we are looking at 2 receiving touchdowns for Chase and 4 for Higgins. So got to take the matchup here. You got to feel good if you own Chase or Higgins here in Week 11. Then looking to DK Metcalf and the Steelers. Bad week in Week 10 against the Chargers. 6.5 fantasy points, 7 targets, 3 grabs, 35 receiving yards for Metcalf this past week. But as we touched on, that Chargers defense really good against wide receivers. And I want to keep reminding you guys, I talk about this almost on a week-to-week basis. Like, the Bengals defense is not good, but they don't give up that many fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And yeah, part of the problem is they're so bad against the run that they rank higher against wide receivers, but ultimately they're 14th overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So it's not like this just crazy good matchup where you can guarantee Metcalf's going to go off. But it's a much, much better matchup than this past week. So I think Metcalf will bounce back this week compared to what he's done over the last 2 weeks. But then again, over the last 2 weeks or so, I mean, this Steelers offense, their passing attack, not looking so good. But still, solid low-end start. Can't call him more than that for Metcalf here in Week 11. Calvin Austin, Roman Wilson, whoever's left over here, there's just no real consistency. Kind of bounces back and forth between one of these 2 guys maybe having like 10, 15-ish fantasy points. I know Wilson's had moments, but the volume's really low. I know Calvin Austin had a decent Week 9 and had some moments early in the year, but once again, the volume's inconsistent. Just can't trust either of these guys in your starting lineup moving in to Week 11. Moving into the afternoon slate of games, we have the Niners traveling to face the Cardinals. Let's start with the Niners side of things. Jauan Jennings, pretty solid. Week 10 overall, finished with 17.1 fantasy points, had a touchdown, 9 targets, 6 grabs, 71 receiving yards. He now has 14.1 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games, and a touchdown in each of the last 2 games. So going to keep him as a risky flex, and it's not really tied to what Jauan Jennings has done or not. It just feels like on a week-to-week basis, I have no idea what's going on with this Niners team. Is Ricky Pearsall going to play? Is Brock Purdy going to be the quarterback? Is Mac Jones going to be the quarterback? hard to say, and that just creates some kind of inconsistency when trying to call what's best for you guys. Also, the Cardinals defense is interesting. Like, they never quite rank good, but it doesn't feel like they're ever that bad. And they do have some solid corner options, but also they've been dealing with some injuries in their secondary. They're 18th overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So it's not great, but it could be a lot worse. And I mean, Mac Jones was very good at quarterback this past week against the Rams, over 300 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. So either way, there's potential here for Jennings or Pearsall, but I have no idea if Ricky Pearsall is even going to be able to play this week. So I think Jennings probably your best bet. I'm going to go ahead and move Kendrick Bourne to the sit category because even with consistent games with Mac Jones at quarterback, he has not lived back up to what he did in weeks 5 and 6. He's been basically irrelevant with 7.4 or less fantasy points in 4 straight games. So he's just a sit. Pearsall, if he plays, very risky flex. Jennings, still a risky flex, but not, once again, not really due to what he's been producing or not producing. It's just due to the uncertainty around this team at the quarterback and wide receiver position. But he's definitely the best potential play when it comes to the Niners wide receivers. Then we move to the Cardinals side of things. The San Francisco 49ers, now a bottom 10 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. So this is a good matchup at home for Marvin Harrison. We know that Jacoby Brissett will be the starting quarterback this week, and he has still been solid despite, offensive and defensive woes for the Cardinals this past week. Brissett still threw for 258 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns. He has thrown for 250 or more passing yards and at least 2 passing touchdowns in every game since he's been the starter. And Marvin Harrison has had 14.3 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games and a touchdown in each of the last 2 games. So I know the volume wasn't great this past week, just 3 catches, but he did have 12 targets and he scored the touchdown, whatever. So this is a solid spot for Marvin Harrison. I think he's going to remain in the start category for me. Michael Wilson gets a little bit of involvement. Greg Dortch does things at times. He ran in a touchdown this past week, but he has 0 catches in the last 2 weeks. So Marvin Harrison, that's it. And then who really knows with the Niners wide receiver rooms. But I think Jennings about as good as it's going to get for the Niners wide receivers here in week 11. Moving along, we got the Seahawks traveling to face the Rams. Let's start with the Seahawks side of things. You already know if you own JSN, you are starting him, your wide receiver 1 in full and half PPR, 20 fantasy points. In week 10, 6 targets, 5 grabs, 93 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Start him no matter who he is facing, and it is worth noting this Rams defense much softer against wide receivers in comparison to running backs. So good spot for JSN in a divisional matchup. Rashid Shaheed, first game with the Seahawks, 1 target, 1 catch, 3.3 fantasy points. Did get used a little bit there in the kick return game as well, but I did talk about this going into week 10. There's a very realistic possibility that Rashid Shaheed doesn't come out and have 9, 6, 12 targets, like he was getting the previous couple weeks with the Saints, and could be disappointing even though he's on theoretically a better team. Doesn't mean he's going to theoretically be better in fantasy, but let's give it some time. It was a short week for him, and we'll see what happens. But for now, he's just a sit. Cooper Kupp had a long reception in week 10, totaled 74 receiving yards, but just 9.4 fantasy points. So nothing to really do there. We're going to continue to sit him. Then Torrey Horton missed this past week. I still have a theory that when Torrey Horton is healthy and active on the field, we could still see some Torrey Horton moments as the season progresses. I don't know if Shaheed's going to just entirely take away that volume. So we'll see how it shakes out here. We still know this is a pass-heavy team, even with Clint Kubiak at the offensive coordinator spot, and then even with, Darnold has actually thrown the football not as much the past 2 weeks, but that's because the Seahawks have just been, tallying it up against opposing teams and doing whatever they want, and the defense has been playing great. So this will be a more competitive matchup, and I think that's good for the overall passing volume, but let's stick with JSN as the only start here in week 11. Then we move to the Rams side of things. Puka Nacua went into the week questionable. He played, had 17.4 fantasy points, 6 targets, 5 grabs, 64 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So if you own Puka Nacua, you know what you're doing on a week-to-week basis. Tough matchup against the Seattle Seahawks secondary, but it's Puka. It'll be fine. You got to roll with them. Then, yeah, we went into the week with a questionable Puka, came out of the week with a questionable Devontae Adams, like a back injury, oblique injury. I don't exactly know what it was, but reports are now saying oblique, but it looked like he was grabbing his back. Whatever, right? 8 targets, 6 grabs, 77 receiving yards, 8 touchdown, 19.7 fantasy points, was still plenty productive. Like he has been on the season, he has scored a touchdown in every game this year, except for 2. Double digits in every game he has scored a touchdown in, so double-digit fantasy points in every game except for 2. So as long as he plays, I'm okay with starting him, but we'll see what the injury report looks like as the week progresses. Anybody else here, Tutu Atwell, Jordan Whittington, even if Adams misses time, I'm not considering them. So you're starting your studs in this one. Everybody else is going to be a sit for me here in week 11. Except we have the Chiefs traveling to face the Broncos. The Chiefs coming off of their bye week. Let's start with them. Rashee Rice has been great since his return from suspension with 18.6 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games and a touchdown in each of those games as well. So, yes, it's a tough matchup against the Broncos. Even without Pat Surtain, this is still the team allowing the fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. They've only allowed 2 receiving touchdowns on the entire season to wide receivers. That is the best in the league by quite a bit. So you got to feel good if you're on Rashee Rice. Even though it's a tough matchup, it's Rashee Rice, so just keep rolling with him. He's a focal point of this Chiefs offense right now. Xavier Worthy, just a risky flex, 6 fantasy points the last time we saw him play. Hollywood Brown, still a risky flex, 9.3 fantasy points the last time we saw him play, but he gets some red zone looks, so very risky, but could be an option. Xavier Worthy, like the ceiling, not crazy high here, especially with Rashee Rice in the mix. So very risky flex, but it's the Chiefs offense. They can always do something and get everybody involved, right? Tyquan Thornton has basically become irrelevant. His total snap share has really progressively gone down as expected with Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy back and healthy and all that, but he'll be a sit. Then Juju Smith-Schuster also seeing a very low overall snap percentage and volume percentage, so just a sit. But once again, it's a Chiefs offense. Anybody can do something on any given week. Then let's talk about the Broncos, because I think most people are ready to drop Courtland Sutton, and I think that's quite the overreaction. I know week 10 sucked, just 5.4 fantasy points, 4 targets, 3 grabs, 24 receiving yards. We've had the emergence of Troy Franklin as well. But Sutton has still had 10 or more fantasy points in every game this year except for 3. Has still been really solid. Still scored a touchdown just 2 weeks ago against one of the best defenses in the league in the Houston Texans. And if you guys forgot, Courtland Sutton had some pretty bad games last year. His trajectory is actually really similar to last year when we look at his numbers overall. Last year he had 4 games with 7.8 or less fantasy points, double digits in every other game. So he's kind of close to that same path. We'll see how it shakes out. But yeah, it's frustrating. 4 targets this past week, 6 targets the previous 2 games for Sutton, and then Troy Franklin has had 8 or more targets in 4 straight games. So he is getting more involvement. But sometimes when you have a wide receiver 1 who's playing very good, which Sutton was playing very solid for the most part the first month and a half of the season, it can open up things for other guys. And this Broncos offense has needed somebody else to be involved in the passing attack, and Franklin has certainly stepped up. Obviously, his chemistry dating back to their college days with Bo Nix at the quarterback position. And so, listen, all I'm saying is I think Franklin is going to be a solid start, but I still think Sutton is in the start category. Even if he's a lower end start, I still think he's going to be solid. But the other thing here is that this is a tough Chiefs defense. They've given up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So not exactly a great spot here, but these are guys that still get a lot of volume. And I know that the Broncos offense, hasn't been super encouraging as of late, but still, just stick with it. These guys have been a little bit sporadic when it comes to like Bo Nix and Courtland Sutton over the past 2 seasons, so I still think that Sutton is in the start category. Franklin, still very solid. When it comes to the Chiefs, it's just Rashee Rice, and that's it here in Week 11. Final game of the afternoon slate will be the Ravens traveling to face the Browns. Let's start With the Ravens, Zay Flowers continues as a low-end start, 11.4 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, 11.4 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2 on the season. He's only scored 1 receiving touchdown on the year. Doesn't really have a tremendous amount of upside. The Browns 11th overall against opposing wide receivers, but they have allowed 10 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers on the season. So this is a pretty good spot. The Browns obviously tougher against the run, but this is also one of those games that could get a little dicey. The Ravens defense improving. Browns defense still pretty dang good. But the last time these two teams met in week 2, Zay Flowers did have 14.9 fantasy points. So solid, but not a ton of upside. When we look to anybody else on this team, I know Rashad Bateman has had some moments, but now he's dealing with an ankle issue. DeAndre Hopkins is on this team, and there's other names, but yeah, I don't know why I'm breaking this down. None of these guys are going to be starts here in week 11. Then, don't look twice. Jerry Jeudy, 19.8 fantasy points in week 10 against the Jets. 12 targets, 6 grabs, 78 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Dylan Gabriel decided to throw the football to a position other than the tight end position. I'm still not ready to trust Jerry Jeudy. That might be a mistake. He could be a risky flex. I mean, the Ravens are a bottom 5 unit against opposing wide receivers. I'm not going to talk you guys out of starting Jerry Jeudy this week if you absolutely need to or you feel like you want to. But I just have a bad feeling about it because, once again, Dylan Gabriel has really just primarily targeted tight ends and leaned on the run game of Quinshon Judkins. That changed a bit this past week. I could see the Browns be in a position this week against the Ravens where they need to throw. Maybe that benefits Jerry Jeudy, but I just don't feel like I'm ready to trust it. So I have Jeudy as a sit, but if you want to start him, I understand, okay? Anybody else here? Cedric Tillman, Isaiah Bond, not going to be options from a fantasy perspective as we approach week 11. All right, then Sunday Night Football, we got the Lions traveling to face the Eagles and what should arguably be the best matchup of the week. Now, disclaimer, of course, I always have to record these before Monday Night Football. The previous week has been played, so if we see a crazy injury to A.J. Brown or Devonta Smith, there will be a pinned comment down below. But let's start with the Lions, who basically did whatever they wanted to at every position against the Commanders in Week 10 on the road. And this is definitely a stiffer matchup this week against the Eagles, but this Eagles defense has still been a bit wishy-washy, and I don't really care who he's facing. Amon-Ra St. Brown is in your starting lineup no matter what. 16.8 fantasy points in Week 10, 8 targets, 5 grabs, 58 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Yeah, he might see Quinyon Williams in this game. Whatever. You got to start Amon-Ra St. Brown if you own him. He is the wide receiver 3 in full PPR, the wide receiver 2 in half PPR. You are rolling with them. I'm going to give it one more week. Just one more week until I take Jameson Williams out of the riskiest flex ever spot. Only one player in the video gets that spot a week, and as of late, it's been Jameson Williams, but he has been very involved over the past 2 weeks. 6 or more targets and a touchdown in each of the last 2 games. And really, over the last 4 games, 6 or more targets in 3 of the last 4 games and a touchdown in 3 of the last 4 games. But in Week 7, 0 fantasy points. So, you still don't exactly know what to expect. Dan Campbell taking over the play calling for the Lions in Week 10. Maybe that helps Jameson Williams out, but he saw very similar production in Week 9 compared to Week 10. So he still feels risky, but the upside's there. And we really liked J-Mo going into Week 10. Talked about him in the nuclear video, one of my favorite kind of sneaky plays for a flex. But that was against the Commanders. And yeah, like I said, the Eagles defense has been wishy-washy. But they're not the Commanders, who might have now the worst defense in the NFL. So J-Mo, still risky, but lots of upside, and you got to at least be encouraged from what we've gotten over the last 2 weeks. But always the potential for a bad game when it comes to J-Mo. Okay, once again, I'm recording this before Week 10 Monday Night Football, so don't yell at me. But A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, always in the low-end start category. My bold assumption here is that Devonta Smith will outproduce A.J. Brown in Week 10, as it's a better matchup when you look at the overall scheme. But still, I like both these guys on a weekly basis. I've been one of the few people, it feels like, who has encouraged you guys not to trade away your Eagles wide receivers throughout the course of the season and to just continue rolling with them. Take the punches. They're always good low-end starts. They might be your wide receiver too. They might be your flex option. They may have some inconsistency, but for the most part, these guys always produce at the end of the season when we look at total numbers. So yes, this is going to be a competitive matchup, and bear in mind the Lions bottom 12 unit when it comes to fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So should be a good spot, should be a high passing volume for both teams in this game. Devonta Smith, AJ Brown, as long as they're healthy, they're in my starting lineups here in week 11. All right, last but not least, we have Monday Night Football. The Cowboys traveling to face the Raiders. Let's start with the Cowboys side of things. They're coming out of their bye week, so we did not see them in action this past week, but the last time we saw them play in week 9, it felt a bit disappointing, but CeeDee Lamb had 15.5 fantasy points against the Cardinals. George Pickens, 13.9 fantasy points against the Cardinals. So last 3 games, both of these players have had double-digit fantasy performances. Yes, Pickens has seen a little bit of decrease in volume with CeeDee Lamb back and active, but he's had 9 targets in 2 straight games. Lamb, 10 targets 3 weeks ago, and 12 targets in week 9. So still plenty of volume to go around for both these guys, even with, Jake Ferguson still getting decent volume at the tight end position. So not a lot to break down here. It's a great matchup. They're coming out of their bye week. It's a good spot, even on the road. Lamb, Pickens, plenty productive. They got to be in your starting lineup. Can't trust any other Cowboys wide receiver. Then we look to the Raiders. Okay, I have everybody as a sit. I know. I mean, I don't know if Geno Smith is going to be the quarterback dealing with a quad contusion, and then Kenny Pickett's the next man up. It's a great spot. They're at home. It's a great matchup. But Trey Tucker, 5.5 fantasy points this past week. Tyler Lockett, 9.4, kind of out of nowhere. Donta Thornton, 1 catch, 1.4 fantasy points. Jack Beschk, 0 fantasy points, okay? And Brock Bowers at the tight end position, 3.7 fantasy points, 1 catch. Now, all of that was against Denver, but it doesn't really give us anything to go off of when trying to predict who could possibly go off this week, because there's a likelihood that somebody will, as the Cowboys have given up the most receiving touchdowns of any team. The wide receivers on the year is 16 receiving touchdowns allowed. The possibilities here. But let me know in the comments, what is your guys' guess for a Raiders wide receiver this week? I guess it's Trey Tucker, but he's had 4 or less targets in 2 straight games, so I can't even really feel good about that. Maybe it's Tyler Lockett. He saw the best volume this past week with 6 targets and 5 catches, but I just don't feel good. And we only have 2 teams on bye weeks. I know there's injuries going on and stuff. Depending on what position you're hurting at, you may need a flex option. There's probably something here. The matchup is there, but I don't trust it in my starting lineup or any of your guys' starting lineups here in week 11. There you guys have it. There's every matchup, every single wide receiver, and who you should be starting or sitting here in week 11 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below, so drop all your fantasy questions down there. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor, helps out the channel tremendously when you guys subscribe and hit that like button on the way out. When the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, we all have everything you could possibly need to dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. So go check out all the content as it drops throughout the week. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.